Hello, friends. This is Maureen Lee Maloney, and welcome back to My Doc Journey, the show where I reveal every step in my process of creating a feature-length documentary, even the steps where I fall down and cry. All right, so I'm here interviewing Karen Whitehead, a documentary filmmaker, primarily about her latest film, which is called Imitating Life, and it is, or the subtitle is The Audacity of Suzanne Heintz, and Suzanne is this really, really cool artist. I'm just gonna read really briefly the description on the IDA website here to give you an idea. Imitating Life, The Audacity of Suzanne Heintz is about a loudmouth girl from Yonkers and her strange and entertaining photographic crusade to change minds about women's roles observed over more than 15 years. Weaving candid and humorous backstage footage with video diaries and archival material, the entire process and struggles inside Heintz's pursuit of her life's work is laid bare in an intimate portrait of an artist, blurring the lines between art and life. As social media catapults her interest in her mannequin-aided portraits of womanhood and perfect family bliss, Heintz's resilience is put to the test by real-life challenges in her fight to harness her viral influence and produce more art for good. Imitating Life unfolds as Heintz races to triumph in art, identity, and survival. And I fortunately got to see this film at the Boulder Film Festival, and I totally love it. I fell in love with Suzanne. She's an incredible person. And I'm excited to talk to you about how you made this film and about your film career in general. So thank you, Karen, for meeting with me and speaking with me.
It's really delightful to be with you, and I want to thank you for being so enthusiastic about the film. You're one of the few people who got a chance to see it before our film festival run was cut short.
Yeah, that's so unfortunate.
Yes, many filmmakers have been struggling with that situation, but we can talk about that later. Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to always talk about the art of documentary filmmaking and my own journey, and help other people who are, also forging a way forward in this sphere. I think documentary film is really important. I think we need it more than ever now. And I'm particularly keen on supporting fellow women who are forging ahead in this sphere, because it is so hard still to do this. And it's still dominated by men.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with all of that. So I'm curious about how you got started in filmmaking. Did you always want to make films?
Yeah, so as you can probably tell by my voice, I'm not a native. I grew up in London, and I was very lucky that I was really close to things like theatre, the arts, and media experiences. It was very popular as a teenager. I'd go with a bunch of school friends to watch programmes being recorded at the BBC in London, a whole variety of programmes. And I was fascinated by that whole world of production, and just seeing how programmes were created, and put on the screen. And we'd go watch a lot of different programs being made, from what you would call talk shows, or a couple of comedy programs, sitcoms as you call them here. And I think that really had a deep influence on me. But I also loved growing up, about every Saturday, the BBC would always show one of the Beatles films. And I'll never forget one Saturday, it was A Hard Day's Night, which was actually made, a couple of years before I was born. And this was Richard Lester's film. And it's actually really, it's worth looking at. I always encourage aspiring filmmakers to go look at it, the documentary filmmakers, because it's very much the first mockumentary. So it's sort of like a musical comedy, and the opening scene is them running, being chased by hordes of fans through one of the main train stations in London.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it is shot and how it is done, and then how the rest of the film is done, if you really look at it, it is so clever, because it has all those documentary elements in visual storytelling that we should all be thinking about when we're making a film. So that film always sat with me, as a big influence on, this is really interesting, just observing, okay, Beatles are a famous band, but it was just that idea of the way the camera was used, the way it was directed, that really inspired me to think about what would it be like to be behind the camera doing this kind of thing. But I was never drawn to fiction. I was always interested in, I think as I got through my high school years, I became much more interested in journalism. So my first jobs actually, while I was in college, I was involved in college radio and TV stations, and I did journalism courses. And so my first job really was in newspaper, though, because it was easier to get jobs in newspaper. And a lot of people would start in newspaper as reporters, and I got involved in more investigative journalism pieces. And then I got a job as a researcher in television. So that's really how it started for me. I came from a pretty traditional journalism background, and then I worked my way up from being a researcher to being a producer and a director on network television programs in the current affairs sphere. And that was a really good background before going into independent production, which I moved into when I moved to the States. And I was based in Washington, D.C., and there's a big indie production scene there. And it was really a great sort of thing to do while I was raising children, to work in independent production and have more of my own schedule, and not doing mad sort of weekly turnaround programs where you'd start in London one day and the next day you'd be flying to New York or somewhere else to interview someone, and it was just crazy schedule, and then the program would be on the air at the end of the week, so you're editing in the middle of the night. I just needed a break from that. That was it was good to I like the idea of inhabiting stories for longer, than those fast turnaround programs, which is what most of my career had been in.
Wow, yeah, that's really cool, and it's interesting that you have that very professional journalistic insight, and especially seeing the BBC productions, because that has to be so totally different from like independent film production, independent documentary production, especially.
Yes, because, well, on the practical level, I worked in big teams, and we were funded.
Yeah.
And we were, so that's a really big difference.
That makes a big difference.
I actually had a salary as well for a few years.
Oh my God, what is that?
I know, what is that? But I think what I got from that experience is it was a lot of on-the-job training. That's how you worked your way up in network television in the UK. And I worked for, I did programs for ITV, Channel 4 and BBC. And it was, you couldn't screw up in terms of on the research. You really had to have it together. So, and there was a lot of fast thinking going on the ground when we were filming and going places, and you had to very quickly get rapport with people you were interviewing. And sometimes, it was harder than other times. Like I spent 3 weeks in Japan tracking down two war criminals. And it was for an anniversary story, and it was about having forgiveness and, not so much restitution, but it was really about the art of forgiveness. And it was for a current affairs doc. And it was really hard work because you're dealing with translations, and misunderstandings all the time while you're filming. I mean, Lost in Translation I lived that really in many ways, including the karaoke for 3 weeks. But at the same time, you're trying to build relationships and it's really hard. So I think those experiences helped me think about how would you do this in something you can completely control yourself, but you have no support network. The support network you have will be what you build for your film, for your story. And so it's a radically different process when you're doing indie production. But for me, my experience of having worked in those kind of a little bit crazy, fast-paced programming and having the journalism background, it saved me from some mistakes, that I could have made very easily, and it helped me get through some of the challenges of especially a first indie film, the film I did before this one. So it's everyone brings their own story, their own experiences into their filmmaking, and I think the one strand is always telling a good story and having a good character. That doesn't change if you're doing, whether you're doing, a TV show or, as it were, or an independent film.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. And I actually have one other question about sort of the difference between the very structured filmmaking and indie filmmaking. I think a lot about, and I think a lot of indie filmmakers probably think a lot about permits and things like that. I'm sure working in a newsroom, you're very buttoned up. All your I's are dotted and all your T's are crossed. But as an indie filmmaker, because of time or budget constraints or whatever it might be, sometimes you're going into a place where you're like, technically you should have a permit, but maybe you're not. Do you have any experience with that or thoughts on that kind of like guerrilla filmmaking, if you will?
Yeah, well, I think all independent filmmaking is guerrilla filmmaking, actually, because that is where I actually liked being released from those kind of bureaucratic constraints. But I didn't, but that doesn't mean I'm forgetting the main principles of journalism and how you deal with access and build trust. I always used to, so from my experience of these last two films, I always made the effort to pick up the phone. A lot of people hide in email. That seems to be a problem we have anyway, currently. I would always pick up the phone and try to build relationships and talk to people about places I wanted to get access to. So rather than having to do the maybe four-fold piles of paperwork that I did when I was working in network television, I would make sure I at least had a verbal, and then I'd back up with an email, and I would always have release forms. I always have release forms with me wherever I go. And I'm quite good at, one of the programs I worked on was a series a little bit like 60 Minutes, and I did quite a lot of doorstepping. So I've done that, and it's based on the justification, principle that exists in sort of, a lot of convention that journalists follow. So I've seen all sides of it, but my goal in filmmaking at this point, and the kind of stories I'm interested in telling and the people I want to work with, it's a collaboration. It's not, if someone really is uncomfortable and doesn't want to give you access somewhere, unless they're like a mass murderer that you and no one else has found, and you're trying to reveal them, I wouldn't really push. You want to have the collaborative process. You don't, there's nothing to be gained from setting up an adversarial situation in the kind of filmmaking I'm doing now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so back to Imitating Life. Tell me a little bit about, how you got started with your film and how you met Suzanne.
Yeah, so So this is great because it actually all happened in Denver. So Suzanne and I met at the Voices Women's Plus Film Festival, which you know is part of the Denver Film Society,
Yeah.
because my first indie doc, Her Aim Is True, which is about this rock and roll photographer that no one ever heard of, but she was a woman who was shooting rock and roll 10 years before Annie Leibovitz picked up a camera. And she was based in Seattle, and she worked in the Pacific Northwest, and she shot some big bands on their first tours, people like Rolling Stones, you might have heard of,
Wow, yeah.
and The Who. So she did some concert photography, but really the film is about the relationship she had with the local bands, and she ended up doing this amazing shoot with Neil Young. But no one had heard of her, and her actual archive was literally in a dumpster and was found. And
What?
I
Wow.
met her when she was 92. And so my film is about really what you'd call a classic artist profile, but it's a hidden story. You know, it's a woman that was doing all this cool, innovative stuff, and you know, extraordinary album covers. And she was 50, you know, in her early 50s when she started doing rock and roll photography. So it's an amazing story, and that film was on the festival circuit and came to Denver. And Suzanne had a short in that festival, which blew my mind. And we were asked to sit on a panel together about women in the arts, and you know, it was called Crossing the Line, I think, and about pushing boundaries and dealing with stereotypes about women's roles and sort of working in this field. And we had a lot in common, and she made me laugh. And I just had to keep talking to her after the panel because I just really wanted to know more about, you know, on one level, that I was fascinated, like how you deal with traveling with mannequins dressed like Cary Grant and getting into taxi cabs in Paris with them. That just what motivated her to do this. You know, I had thousands of questions in my head, and she was so funny and she was so open. And we just started this conversation with, well, you know, would you, you know, if what about if I actually observe you doing what you're doing and what that would look like? And she really loved my film about this photographer, and it was just interesting. There was a sort of a crossover and an open door because of, you know, we were both in that festival, and we were both women who were exploring visual storytelling in different ways and had different experiences. And I just felt like there was something about Suzanne. You know, she was being really gutsy and defiant, and I just thought it should be more in the center. It should have more, you know, I could see an interesting journey with her, seeing where it was going and how it would end and what she was trying to do and the impact she wanted to have, you know. And I just thought it was just interesting, you know, to me. I could see her experience as something that would be valuable, you know, to bring to a wider audience, but also explore, you know, in so many ways.
Absolutely.
You know, really behind the scenes. And I mean, that's goes back to my whole thinking about why I love making documentary film and the documentary process, is that I think you really always have to tell a good story. And you have to have a really strong, at least one strong main character. And I talk about it in those terms, like people talk about fiction, because, you know, I don't want to go to watch a film and be lectured. You know, I want to be, you know, inspired, and I want to be made to think, but I want it to be like a movie. I want it to be a good story. So that I just felt Suzanne was up for it, and it was a really unique collaboration. And I brought on board a close colleague, producing partner, Catherine Wilkins de Francis, like me, based in DC, Washington DC at the time, and I wanted to see what her reaction was to Suzanne, and we kind of had the same sort of thoughts about it and interest in Suzanne, and she was totally up for it, and so we, you know, it was a great bit of teamwork being able to work with Catherine, who's an amazing producer, And I loved that experience. After you've done one indie film really on your own, it's really nice to share the producing and have someone else on the same page as you about figuring all the stuff out about how to put it together. But going back to Suzanne, I just think, she's another example of women who are putting themselves out there and are really being quite brave and saying something that's worth listening to. But visually, in the way she does it, in her experience, it can be very entertaining as well to watch.
Oh yeah. That's awesome. It blows my mind a little bit to hear your story about the rock and roll photographer, because definitely when I was watching the film Imitating Life, the thing that struck me was like how fucking punk rock Suzanne is. That was the thought that I had. When you first see her, punk rock is not what you think, because we all have like the image of what punk rock looks like in our heads, right? But yeah, when you hear about her story and just what she does, you're like, oh, she's so punk rock. That's what I thought.
Yeah,
anyway.
I think that's totally true. We even in the soundtrack,
Yes.
the soundtrack gives you a little bit
Yep.
of that characteristic in places.
Totally, it totally does. It's a great soundtrack too. So how did you start with the film, and did you
Right.
have a clear story? Like, kind of what was your pre-production like for this?
Okay, so really, as I say, I immediately, went back after meeting Suzanne, thinking about all the pieces. I think even on the plane ride back from the festival, I was writing notes about the pieces that were going, and all my questions, and I just had this about 10 pages of scribbles and Venn diagrams, with boxes and thinking it through. And I took that to Catherine, and I showed Catherine her short. And then we did a chat with Catherine. I think Catherine and I had several kind of like, FaceTimes and phone calls and thinking it through. And we came up with a basic treatment, which is what most people start with. But it was based on seeing what are the point. We had to sit down and come up with what were the key. What makes this a film? I think that's something you have to always ask yourself at the beginning. Mm-hmm. I'm not one of those people who thinks you just go and shoot something and then it naturally just comes together. I think that's a load of rubbish, actually. Some people might go do that and it works for them. That, to me, isn't what I'm doing. So the first critical piece we felt we had access and archive. So we have our, Suzanne totally up for it and interested in expanding and being able to give us video diaries and things, and we talked that through. Beyond what she'd made these 2 or 3 shorts in the course of the film. While we were doing the film, she had her shorts. She had a short about the whole project that she calls Playing House. And then she had created one, and I helped her with some behind the scenes stuff about that, about the wedding that she doesn't really marry a mannequin, as I'd like to point that out. It's an artistic performance. Mm-hmm. Performance art is what we're talking about, and extreme art activism. So she had those, but then we talked about expanding, and she was willing to put a camera on a dashboard of a car because she always has a long commute to work. And that is where she does a lot of her thinking. So from my point of view, that I knew we would capture some really off the cuff and interesting moments, which we in fact inject throughout the film. Mm-hmm. But so access and archive, and by archive, because she's been doing this at the point that I met her for more than 15 years, she had, or be it being suggested to her as well, to do some, she's done some filming with like the first sort of early smart films of just taking the mannequins to places. So you have photographs, you have some video, we have the opportunity to expand and do more in terms of like real sort of behind the scenes stuff and video diaries, as well as traditional shooting. So that is unique. And the kind of access she was willing to give us really, I think it does give you a chance to take the audience sort of somewhere other than the usual artist profile. I didn't want to do something traditional. I wanted it to be quirky and offbeat and different. And she lends herself to that. So I think that, so our pre-production process really was from that base point, also peppered with doing lots of obvious research about, I watched with Catherine a lot of documentaries that have been done on artists in the last 10, 15, 20 years, going back 20 years. And we came to a short list of 5 or 6 that we thought showed interesting elements in terms either of how they were structured or visual style or how the artist's voice was used, or, and that was important to me to see sort of what we felt, from a storytelling point of view may or may not work, or just to sort of sit in our heads and sort of, think through. And then we came up with a list of what we call our themes, like everyone does, in order to build more of a outline structure for shooting, and a timeline, so those are the nuts and bolts things that I'm sure any other filmmaker listening to this will understand. You've got to have your outline structure, a timeline that connects your character and their journey, or events that are coming up, or key markers in, key points to the story, or, situations they're dealing with. And that was our baseline, and that's how we kind of went. So we met in 2014 at the festival in March, and the film was, the film festival cut was completed in the early summer of 2019. So that gives you, so like a lot of films, it's usually at least 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds about
right.
That's
the baseline.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, but production and pre-production often get meshed, and I think a lot of people don't really realise that, because you start in one direction and then things happen and you pull back and you go in another direction. I mean, I think that happens to everyone.
Oh,
and
yeah.
So you kind of go back and forth a bit.
No, for sure. I mean, sometimes, a worldwide pandemic happens, like, just right as you're, like, early on starting your film.
Yeah.
And, who could have seen that happen?
Yeah.
Not this girl, I can tell you that.
It makes us stronger.
Yes, you're right. It does make us stronger. Did you do any other, like, other than your one producer, did you do any reaching out to larger production companies or networks or anything like that?
I think Catherine and I felt like we felt very strong as a team, and we did bring in, we had 2 or 3 people consulting for us, I think. And I was actually going to say, for anyone listening to this that's looking at documentary filmmaking, you need an inner circle of 2 or 3 people to bounce off as consultants. And I don't mean your mum or your partner who are going to tell you, yeah, that's great, I love it. I actually do mean people with a professional kind of background in this, who will be your first sounding off point. What does that look like to you? You show them a couple of scenes or something, or you talk them through something you're doing or trying to get reactions from, because you need that. So I'm a big believer in that process of having some kind of ongoing kind of a mini pool, or almost like a focus group maybe.
Yeah.
Because you need to know, does anyone want to watch your film? If you're going to spend 5 years immersed in something, and as we all know, it's a lot of blood, sweat and tears, making a film and finding funding. and believing in it. You can't make a film for yourself. You have to make a film that you want. The whole point is to reach an audience, and you need some people to bounce off. So we did have, this core 2 or 3 people in our network that wouldn't be afraid to tell us, don't get it, I'm not sure about that. You need that. Or what do you think about this? Have you got any ideas of where we could find this or how we might do this? And I've always been open to that kind of process. And I think the other things, we were fortunate because of the network we're in. I guess where the women in film community is so important. I actually brought on board for principal photographer a fantastic, editor and video journalist, Pierre Catar, who's now based in Rome. He's been doing some incredible stories about the impact of the pandemic there, and he does stuff. People see his stuff in the New York Times and all over. But he's a fantastic shooter because he's got an editing mind too, and really good with this visual storytelling. And we wanted some really candid and personal stuff, and so we used a Canon 5D and a Sony, and we just had this it's always small cameras and just really very accessible. And he's really interested in photography too, because he'd helped me with some editing on the rough cut of Her Aim Is True. So we had a really good connection. So we were able to bring him on board for shoots in Denver and New York, which were 2 big shoots we did, 2 of our main shoots. And then we hired other people or worked with other people too. And there were a couple of people that through the production here, people would help with Suzanne on her shorts, who were fantastic and helped us on some stuff too. So we were very, very lucky, the combination of working with fantastic production support here and in DC, because that's what you need, because wherever you're based, you've got to figure out a network. So that's always good. But sometimes you just have to pick up local crews and based on recommendations. But basically between Denver production scene and the DC and New York women in film groups, we were able to really, and Suzanne's network, we were able to really come up with what we needed and had fantastic support from a lot of people.
Were there ever people that you started working with that you were like, oh, okay, this isn't working out, we have to go with somebody else? Because I'm curious to know how people deal with that sort of thing, where you at some point, you have artistic differences or whatever it might be, and you just have to break up a little bit.
Yeah, I think in my career that's happened to me 1 or 2 times. I think we had I've been lucky that a lot, on both my features, I've had in each situation fantastic local support. When I say local, I mean local to the subject. So I had a great production team based in Seattle, because it was financially, I flew back and forth to Seattle over a 3-4 year period to make that film. And it was urgent because, your subject matter is 92. You've got to really, you don't waste time. And I was recommended, there's a very lively production scene there. And I was recommended a fantastic team to work with. And I managed to keep that team over that period. And like me, they just wanted this story to be out. And, it worked. And I used that network because I think that's something important. Your subject matter isn't always on your doorstep. And if it's not, which is, in both my cases with these films, you do rely on recommendations. So I've not had a situation, I think, it's more happened to me when I was doing those fast turnaround things, and you would just go pick up a local, news and sound person. Once in a while, you realize you're getting someone who doesn't, they're just doing it it's a 1 day's job for them, right. And they're not dedicated into it like you are. and I've had those sort of situations. The most common situation I've had has it's not so, I don't know if it's artistic differences, but sometimes it's just plain right male chauvinism gets in the way. And I have once had a cameraman, this is for a UK network television program, went to a shoot, and a cameraman, our train was late or something, and we picked up a car and we were getting to this location to shoot, and the cameraman had already set up the interview in the room, and I had a male researcher with me, and he started talking to him, and I was the director. And I said, okay, thank you I appreciate, the way you said, that was nice of you to experience that. Can you now, we're actually going to shoot this way, we're not doing it that way, we're going to do this. And he still continued to talk to the male researcher.
Oh, no.
And that is not, I'm talking about, that happened. I'm hoping that happens less now, but that sort of thing happened a lot in network TV stuff. But I find the independent film community very collaborative in this country, and I've not had, once in a while you might get someone that you think you're not sure if that person's the little, somebody on the general production team, they might be a little bit slow in terms of you're saying, okay, we need to get this going now. But I've not had a real fundamental artistic difference issue with any of the production team we've worked with really on anything.
Sure. Well, that's good. It does sound like it's valuable to have a team and, have that relationship between each other and understanding of that common goal that you're all working towards.
Yeah, but I would say on that point, though, if it's possible to try and have some consistency, at least have a principal photographer, a DP that you can take to at least the majority of your shoots. If that works out for you practically and financially, I highly recommend that, because you can tell when it really is evident when you've got that same eye. Or the continuity is really important, and it's relationship building as well with your subject matter, and just makes the shoots a lot easier. Because they're long days.
All right, moving into the big question that everybody always has about fundraising, and what was your fundraising strategy?
Well, first of all, you have to be realistic. If you are making a film that is an artist profile, someone who's under the radar, it's really hard, to have someone that's under the radar. And then it's a quirky offbeat art stock. That puts you pretty much close to the bottom of the list. You have to really, it's not a hard-hitting social issue in your face thing that because although funding has improved in the last 10 years, particularly for women, there are a lot more. The list is longer of grants you can apply for. But that's the good news. The bad news is there are many, many more people accessing, quite reasonably the documentary production. And the gear is cheaper. It's easier to get going. People are making whole films on their iPhones. Your competition with levels are so much higher now. So even though there's more grants, also grants is a long process, some 6 months or more. It depends what your subject is and what's going on. Most people are constantly grant writing while they're filming. And that's really our situation, is that we certainly created a pitch deck. I mean, Catherine and I have both produced, been involved with several other films, either as the producer or the director or part of a team. So this was not our first rodeo, and we really understand that climate. We've both been involved with crowdsourcing campaigns, Kickstarter stuff, so we've both had that background. So we just went at it on 5 or 6 different levels, but in the end, what worked for this film, we got shortlisted for a couple of grants, but and we had a couple of angel investors that were interested, and that did, at least in one case that did actually turn into funding. But it's really what worked for us was private fundraising and donations, and reduced rates, the usual, a lot of in kind, that
nice.
usual mixture. So I think this is a really tough question for me, because I like to say that I agree with the principle that you shouldn't really film anything until you've got a grant, but we all know that you have to at least make a pretty darn decent 10-minute fundraising trailer, if nothing else.
For sure.
So I when I mentor other filmmakers, I always say, you do have to get your credit card out a little bit, sometimes more than you intend to, and make something. And then but the key thing is you must find a core audience and group of supporters. But I would say apply for grants, but don't rely on them.
Yeah. So it sounds like you were really kind of pounding the pavement looking for individual donors.
Yeah. Yes, we did. And in the end, it was we got to the point where we got to as far as we could, and we stopped. We actually ended up a whole year not doing anything, because we just couldn't. We started to, you do doubt yourselves at some point, because you think, maybe it's a really hard film until you see her whole story and whole film. I think Suzanne's story is hard for people to scratch their heads and look at you and not sure they get it, even though we had really good responses from our fundraising trailer. It's still, it's also everything, we budgeted it like you do, as everyone does, in a realistic way. It's always, the post-production stuff was hard, it was hard to finish. It always where you get stuck, I think, when you can shoot so much and then you have to stop and you think you've got the arc and you've got it together, but you've got to find a way to fund post-production to continue. And we had lots of material, but it was just really hard to find. That last bit is always harder, I think.
Yeah. At least you have your footage by then, right?
Yeah.
Do you think, were there any particular tactics that really helped you with the finding donors? Like, did you look at certain organizations or anything like that? Like people who donated to arts organizations, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, we went through all of that stuff, and we certainly tapped everything, people connected to the arts. And even when we were shooting in New York, we had an event at a gallery where she was having her work shown, and we made some connections there. But I just think it was a particularly difficult time as well, when I think crowdfunding has gone through in the last couple of years, particularly. It's, in the early years of Kickstarter, it was great, but now crowdfunding in the last 2 or 3 years, it's much harder.
Right.
So it wasn't easy. I'm certainly, we made it, but it wasn't easy. It was really tough. It was tougher than when I did my first film.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
I think so, yeah.
So about, you kind of mentioned that, your pre-production and your production were kind of going on around the same time. About how long was it in total, and about how long, I guess at this point, what we haven't really talked about is how long did that post-production take?
Yeah, so the whole journey, as I said, was about 5 years. And we had pretty much a whole year where we just kind of came to a halt because we were trying to find a way forward into post-production. We had a really good relationship with a fantastic editor in DC, Pippa McBride, and she was totally up for helping us through, and we collaborated with her, and we were very lucky that she was a big fan of telling the story, and she helped us, gave us some good guidance and gave us a way to move forward, really, because she was willing to work at a really reasonable rate for us. And I think that really helped, and she we had a collaborative process with the writing, and from that point getting to a based on our expanding our treatment, that evolves throughout the process. So I think we had about a 6-month period where we were just sort of gearing up to get into the edit room, when we had the finance ready to go. And Catherine really did an amazing job pulling that all together. So we were very lucky that it happened, and she worked very hard to make it happen.
So it sounds like you kind of already had everything shot before you really started editing. Is that right?
Yes. Well, obviously, along the way, we made 2 or 3 short things and like a fundraising trailer,
right,
like you do. But basically, we had a situation where we worked through from our treatment to writing the story, writing it into more like a almost like a paper cut, right? Which is a really old-fashioned thing, but that's because I came out, my background. So you see, like actually doing a paper cut, and I do the old-fashioned thing with, Catherine, where we had all our index cards and move them around, on a board and things like that, and lay them out and play with different, themes, key bites, and just ideas, and then looking at how it worked in the structure we thought we had, the story arc. And we had all that, and we had Pippa involved with it, as we were going into, to create a rough cut, and from that, a film festival cut. So it's about, I'm trying to think, I think it probably was several months of working it through to get before we actually sat down. And then I guess I must have been about 6 weeks, 7 weeks editing, I think, to get to the final cut.
Well, and I'm sure, doing that paper edit really, saves you time and money in the actual edit suite, right?
Yeah, I mean, you still, in the end, it's the whole story of editing, you still are doing a lot in that period, like Pippa's in, but we're looking at things, we're going, that doesn't work, what about this? Because things sometimes don't work on paper, that when you do that, but it's really important we had a close collaborative process with Pippa, and she was our third eye,
So what are the next steps with this film? You have distribution, right?
Yeah, so well, what happened was we were amazed. We got into Doc NYC, which, because and that's like the largest documentary film festival in the States, and that really was very exciting and blew our minds, because we just made the deadline to get it in to be considered, and from our edit, and that was so exciting. And then we started to get multiple interests from different distributors, and just out of that, and we started to get other festival invites, but COVID shut us down. But fortunately, we'd been talking with one distributor particularly, and we were also working with a consultant that we met at about our festivals and onward strategy. So we had hooked up with a consultant we'd met at Doc NYC2, which was really helpful. But we basically had a deal coming, so it worked out for us. In the time of COVID, we actually found a distribution deal. So the film is being distributed later this summer by Journeyman Pictures. They're a London-based independent film distributor. So they're currently looking at TV broadcast stuff. I don't know, it's ongoing currently as we speak, and then it will be a worldwide streaming release. But right now, because of COVID, as most people are finding, there are no, the new rules are there are no rules. The whole thing about digital distribution is all over the map. But we are going to be, so one of the festivals we were going to be in is going to be doing an online festival, so there will be, people can get a sneak preview of the film before its worldwide release. So in July it's going to be part of the Salem Film Fest. Nice. And they'll be really, setting up a link and selling tickets for that soon, so it will be seen. So 1 week in July it will be available through Salem Film Festival to be seen before our worldwide release.
Nice. And is there a website or a way people can find out about that worldwide release when it happens?
Yeah, so it's Journeyman Pictures, and I can send you the link and you can post that. And I think it just says coming, and the trailer's there, and it just says coming soon at the moment. But, it's great. We've kind of, it's our baby, but we've just handed it over to a distributor. So that's really nice. And then we, they also work with international festivals, so we may may be some other screenings that come up like that, as well as the availability on, major platforms. But I don't know exactly what those will all be yet.
Cool. Well, I hope it gets put up on a major platform, because I would love for tons of people to see this film. I just think Suzanne is a great role model. I think we need to see more people, more women like Suzanne in our media.
Yeah, right? I couldn't agree more. That's what I thought when the moment I met her. I thought, oh my goodness, she's a tour de force.
Yes.
Very cool.
Nice. All right, so last question is about advice, and what is the best advice that you've ever been given, or maybe you have some advice that nobody ever gave you that you wish that they had?
Well, on a little level, funny level, I will confirm that filming with mannequins is much harder than it looks, and you do have to have a good sense of humour and lots of patience to make it happen. So on a funny level, yes, they say don't ever work with children or animals, but I can tell you, working with mannequins,
you would amend that to include mannequins.
Yeah. But on a serious level, the best bit of advice I was ever given, which I'm happy to share, is I used to go to several, when I was just working on my first film, I went to a lot of industry meetups in DC, and then one of the best ones I went to, if anyone ever gets a chance to go to, is Sheffield Documentary Film Festival in the UK. It's amazing. They have incredible workshops. And a lot of people who work in the American, indie film world, and key players always go to Sheffield too. It's very accessible. And the best advice I was given by I heard on a panel at Sheffield was, you have to enjoy what you're doing in every step of the way. You've got to be really, really 100% in. Yeah. The actual journey itself, everything, even the bad moments, as well as the good moments. You've really got to embrace them. And it's really an immersive experience, and you've got to go with that. And that is the best advice I was ever given, because it's so tough at times. You can sort of get really sick of your film and what you're doing, and sometimes you can't deal with it, and you're dealing with all these challenges. But if you just remember, why, you've got to really love it. You've got to love what you're doing on the bad days as well as the good days, because in the end, and this is the advice that was given on this panel, that you end up with a better film, and you can see it in the film. You've got to love what you're doing, the story you're trying to tell. And because it takes several years usually, it's really important that that you have that sense of it. So that is the best advice I think I was given. And I will add a piece of advice that I always pass on, is you can get away with some poor visuals sometimes, when you're in a bloody car, like we were filming in a car, or just not great backgrounds and challenging visuals, but you will never get away with shit sound. You if your story is to be really taken on board by an audience, they have to hear it. They have to hear everything well. Do not underestimate how important sound is. Invest in good sound in the field, and then put the money into really good post-production sound.
Yeah. Well, those are both great pieces of advice. So thank you so much. It was great speaking with you.
Okay, you're very welcome, and good luck with your own filmmaking journey.
Thank you.